All right.
All right.
See that?
Enjoy.
Awesome. Good deal. So yeah, my name is John ASKEW. Good morning. And I'm going to talk about a simple way that you can eliminate an entire class of attacks from your Active Directory environment. Sounds pretty good, right? So this type of attack involves Kerberos, which you may be familiar with as the primary authentication protocol for Active Directory. Kerberos is a huge beast that we could easily spend a whole conference discussing, but I'm going to try to laser focus in on one specific aspect. But even narrowed down, there's a lot to cover in 20 minutes, so I will attempt to go very fast, pun intended. But when I fail to explain something well, I'm more than happy to answer questions afterwards in the chat, offline. Just reach out. I'll be happy to answer whatever I can. So our screenplay here today starts with a very brief introduction / origin story, followed by a 3-act narrative arc describing our problem and our solution. And we'll end with a classic flash forward epilogue. So Kerberos, like myself and many of you, was a child of the 1980s. If you were born in the 80s, no doubt you understand just how much of an impact that has had on your identity, your mannerisms, cultural references, and inside jokes, so on and so forth. For instance, I love this idea of, hidden treasure hunting with friends, like in this classic movie. And of course, when I show up late to something and folks are already in the thick of it, I like to yell out, "Hey, you guys!" Similarly, I'll be downstairs sweeping up the kitchen, and if nobody's around, I'm going to be very tempted to take that broomstick, wave it around like a bow staff, and start singing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles theme song. I mean, we are who we are. And who Kerberos is, born in 1988, it's a product of its era. You can see kind of a brief history of the early life of Kerberos here. Notably, version 5 of Kerberos, which we are still using today, was created in 1993 with RFC 1510. Another key point in Kerberos' early life is when Windows decided to adopt Kerberos as its primary method of network authentication, replacing the legacy NTLM protocol that's, almost gone 30 years later. Then in 2005, we have some minor revisions to version 5, but it's still version 5. And today we've got numerous extensions to Kerberos, which have added features and attempted to shore up weaknesses. But that core from the 80s is still there and still influences the protocol today, which is going to be important to our story. If you are new to Kerberos, or like me, you could use a quick refresher if you haven't thought about it for a week, I would briefly walk through how Kerberos messages are exchanged in a typical AD environment. So your client, which is your Windows workstation or laptop, on the right, you've got your KDC, your key distribution center, which is your Active Directory domain controller. And then you've got some type of application server that you want to log into. There's a few steps for this to happen. First of all, your client is going to send something called pre-authentication information over to the domain controller. This is typically some information encrypted with your domain user password. The domain controller is going to send back a TGT, or a ticket granting ticket, which is essentially your session cookie or session token for the domain. It's going to allow you to re-log in for a limited time, so you don't have to keep typing in your password. And so your client doesn't have to store your password insecurely, in theory. So whenever you want to log in, then you send the TGT back to the domain controller. It gives you a service ticket that is good for just the specific application server you want to log into. And then when you connect to that app server, you give it the service ticket and it will let you in. And that's how messages flow in a typical AD Kerberos environment. So with that background out of the way, scene 1. With any good coming of age story, our central characters start off relatable, maybe even likable, but also a little bit naive, a little bit immature. There must be some fatal characteristic or awkward situation they'll have to try to overcome. and some worldly wisdom to gain in the process. In this 1987 romantic comedy, Can't Buy Me Love, both Cindy and Ronald struggle to reconcile how they want others to see them with who they are on the inside because of some different blind spots that they have. For today's story, those blind spots center around some of the cryptographic design from the 1980s. If we look at those messages that are flowing around, if we read the specifications, we're going to note a few things about Kerberos 5 messages. They will encrypt message fields, individual message fields, only where necessary. We will sign the plain text of the field. And then when we receive a Kerberos message, we're going to process the whole message, including all the plain text, and then only decrypt the fields that are needed for whatever we're trying to do. Now, I'm not a cryptographer, but everything I've read and everything folks have told me, my understanding is we've learned a lot from the past decades of some cryptographic failures, and modern crypto systems kind of flip a few of these things around. In a modern secure crypto system, we're going to encrypt the entire message. We're going to sign that encrypted message. And then when we receive a message, before we do anything else, we're going to validate the signature. We're going to authenticate that message so we don't accidentally try to decrypt something that's been tampered with and somehow release some side channel information to an attacker. So drilling into, I've had several folks talk about Wireshark this morning, pulling up a packet from Wireshark, one of these Kerberos request messages. You'll see that we do have some encryption. Here is the pre-authentication information that we talked about before, the encrypted timestamp that's encrypted with our domain user password. But everything else in this packet, in this message, is unencrypted. So an attacker can tell a lot of things about the message, like who's sending it, where they're sending it to, what kind of encryption is being used. And even more concerning, most of those fields are also what we would call malleable, which means we can tamper with them. We can change them. We can modify them without invalidating the message. So a recipient of this message won't be able to tell that these fields have been changed because there's no authentication on them. Kerberos also has an error message type, and this is even more of a concern because the entire error message is malleable. So we can forge entire error messages, and the recipient in our Kerberos environment will have no way to tell that it's not a valid error message. And we can use this to our advantage as an attacker. I think this has been excused somewhat in the past because something about protected internal networks, but I think we're supposed to be zero trust now. So yeah. Now that you know this, maybe you're like Ronald, thinking that things would have been so much simpler if we had just bought the dang telescope instead. But our plot has advanced. We can't backtrack now. Things are just starting to get good. Scene 2. Confession, I like offensive security because, like the Goonies, I love the idea of hidden treasure and being the person to find something unique. But I also like it because of the way that attacks tell us uncomfortable things about ourselves and allow us the opportunity to grow. Kind of like how Will Wheaton's character Gordy gains a better understanding of grief and friendship through the encounters with their town bully in the 1986 Rob Reiner drama Stand By Me. So what can attacks teach us about Kerberos and our AD environments? Bringing up our diagram from earlier, if we can insert a machine in the middle into network traffic right here, and there's myriad ways to do this. There's tons of different ways that this can happen. We can exploit weaknesses in Kerberos 5 traffic. We can forge error messages, such as when we intercept pre-authentication information, we can respond with a forged error. We can also modify request and reply messages in flight. So here we have a request that's sent from the client. We can change stuff and then forward it on to the domain controller. And this allows us, these different things allow us to trick the client or the domain controller into helping us as an attacker. And this leads to some practical attacks. So one example of practical attacks we can do here is to downgrade encryption types. One example in particular is pre-authentication roasting, where we can downgrade pre-authentication encryption from a client, force them to use a weaker encryption type, and then use that artifact in offline password cracking. If the password's weak, then we'll have a good chance of cracking it. We can also do things like replay valid ticket requests. A great example of this is Charlie Clark's roast in the middle attack that he wrote about in 2022. This allows you to do Kerberosing without being authenticated. And if you know anything about Kerberosing, you typically have to have at least a user account credential in order to do Kerberosing. But this will allow a different method that doesn't require authentication. Although I do think that Microsoft has mostly resolved this now as of a couple months ago. There's also been several session key recovery attacks recently in the past couple years. One of which was written about by James Forshaw of Google Project Zero. Discovered a weak encryption type included in Microsoft Active Directory that shouldn't have been there, but we were able to downgrade that and then do some forgery to basically compromise any user account as long as you could intercept the Kerberos traffic for that account. Could even be a machine account or a domain administrator account. Some pretty cool stuff. They patched it. Then I was researching that attack and I found another method to do a similar thing. Basically, it's kind of like how Jeff Spicoli was in the right place at the right time when he managed to rescue Brooke Shields. Unfortunately, as great as they are, Microsoft's bounty didn't quite cover Van Halen playing at my birthday party this year. So let's, I think we got time. Let's try to do a quick live demo of one of these downgrade attacks. I've got a lab environment prepared here with two freshly, right out of the box, built Windows Server 2025 preview machines, brand spanking new, a domain controller, and another member server in the domain. And then we've also got a attack box that's an Ubuntu server. Network diagram looks about like this, where the two Windows machines think they are communicating directly, but we've routed them to go through the MITM box so we can demonstrate how these attacks work. This is just like the 1986 John Hughes comedy Ferris Bueller's Day Off, when Dean Rooney thinks he's talking to Ferris's girlfriend's dad, Mr. Peterson, played here by Ferris Bueller himself. He is actually talking to Ferris's best friend, Cameron. Dean Rooney can't tell that he's being tricked because, just like Kerberos messages, these analog phone lines don't have digital signatures. And also, Cameron's range is pretty incredible. So I'm going to attempt to do this live. We've got our member server here. We've got our MITM box here. And then we've got our domain controller here. And they're all, both the Windows machines are running a recent build of Server 2025 preview. So about as new as you can get. I've got a tool here that I wrote to do MITM proxying of Kerberos traffic. We will do a Wireshark capture just for fun. And we'll trigger an authentication. We'll trigger a ticket request using the command line here. And of course, something has broken. That's what I get. All right, rather than spend a lot of time troubleshooting this, I will switch over to the demo that I recorded just last night. So our, again, client machine running Windows Server, our MITM machine, and our domain controller. Good deal. So we'll run our tool to do the downgrade attack, we will run Wireshark so we can see details on the client, and then we'll trigger our ticket request. So you'll see we make a ticket request from the client, and our MITM box responds with an error message, which we will highlight here. Past me is so slow. So if we drill into the details of the packet, we see that we have basically said we only accept RC4 HMAC MD5 encryption for pre-authentication. And then our tool has conveniently dumped an artifact to hashcat that we can do offline cracking against. Little copy and paste magic here. And then run hashcat just to show that nothing is up my sleeve. This is, in fact, a crackable artifact, and we've got the password here. Awesome. So sorry about the whatever was the problem with the live thing, but luckily we had the recording. You can find the tooling here on my GitHub, including the code that I used to proxy just now, along with some other stuff that I've written mainly for researching network protocols. So use it at your own risk, but I've also used it in some red team exercises. If you got any questions about any of that, just let me know. So now that we know we're vulnerable, scene 3, how do we defend ourselves? Well, like Ralph Macchio's character Daniel LaRusso in the 1984 classic and one of my favorites, The Karate Kid, we need to teach Kerberos some new moves. How do we teach Kerberos new moves? With protocol extensions. So we have RFC 6113, which is fun because it rhymes, that was released in 2011 with a lot of input from Microsoft. This basically extends Kerberos' pre-authentication capabilities to allow more flexible methods of pre-auth. But the important thing for us today is it includes something called FAST, which stands for Flexible Authentication Secure Tunneling. But essentially, it allows us to protect our messages, our Kerberos messages. Fast armoring works basically like this. The client machine account will do the normal Kerberos 5 authentication with the TGT request and reply. And if you know anything about machine accounts in Active Directory, they've typically, unless you've done something very wrong, they've got a long randomly generated password that's not, you're not going to be able to do password cracking against offline successfully. So it'll do the old style of authentication for the machine account, but then after that, it's able to establish a secure tunnel between the client and the domain controller. And then any subsequent messages between the two are protected, meaning they are signed and encrypted. So we can't theoretically do the same attacks that we've been doing. And if that has you falling asleep from reading RFCs, then Microsoft has you covered. In Server 2012, they added this feature. They advertised that it protects against offline dictionary attacks, which is good. That means we can't pull stuff off the wire and throw it into hashcat and crack it. But even more importantly, I think they have authenticated Kerberos errors. And it doesn't say it here, but they've authenticated other messages as well as part of this fast process. So you're not going to be able to exploit the malleability of those message fields like we were talking about before, at least according to this. If you read about it, it's pretty straightforward to implement. There are 3 policies, one on the KDC, the domain controller, to enable support. And then there are 2 policies that I've found are important on the client side. And if you want to break it down into just a 4-step method here, first, you're going to find this policy, KDC support for claims, compound authentication, and Kerberos armoring, and set that to supported to enable it on the domain controller. Then on the client side, you're going to set the same type of policy to enabled. And I think you could probably do these in either order, but this is the order I did them in. Basically enabling fast on both sides. Then it gets a little tricky, but you're gonna, in order to protect against downgrade attacks and other types of attacks on the client side, you're gonna have to set the client policy to fail authentication requests when armoring is not available. Enable that, and then if you're sure that all of your clients in your environment are forced to use fast or support fast, then you can set on the domain controller also the strongest policy of failing unarmored authentication requests to prevent tampering on the server side. Pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of information out there. I think Daryl Baker pushed a blog post for Trimark Securities Hub in the past week or so. So go check that out for a little more details. But don't take my word for it. Take my word for it with a demo. So here is the same environment, but we've enabled these policies. So on the KDC policy, you can see fail unarmored authentication requests is set. And then we have both of those client side policies enabled as well. So if we go back to our MITM machine and do the same attack as before, and then we trigger another ticket request from the command line, we get the attempted login is invalid. And that's because our client is now sending request messages using fast. You can see the pre-authentication fast message. And because the client is using fast, but we're responding with a normal error message, not a fast error message, the client is going to ignore that because it doesn't trust it anymore. So we've basically fixed or resolved that attack that we just performed. If you want some details about how this works at a message level, we can pull up Wireshark again and see now in our request, we have a signature for the entire body that can be authenticated by the recipient. And we also have the pre-authentication information encrypted using fast instead of just encrypted using the potentially weak domain user's password. And error messages are also required to be fully encrypted, which encryption includes authentication. Good deal, right? It's nice when the solution exists as soon as you find out about the problem. So the final element of our coming of age story is the flash forward epilogue. Just ask Marty McFly. Better to flash forwards than backwards because there's no risk of accidentally making your mom have the hots for you. But in today's story, will you end up as a hopeful protagonist that overcomes their weaknesses to move forward? Or will you be a tragic side character that remains stuck in the past? So, like all the characters in the stories we've talked about, there's still challenges ahead. Of course, there's no silver bullets in cybersecurity. Fast is no exception. It seems simple to deploy in a lab, but as everyone knows, production can be pretty complex. So you want to roll this out with a good plan in place. And it may not work for everyone. Also, I think fast needs some more offensive research. There's been very little information publicly about researching fast from a security perspective. And it's definitely not perfect. And there's obviously, just looking at it from a high level, some potential for MITM during that initial bootstrapping. But I think they've done a good job with what they have, right? Patching onto the existing Kerberos design and infrastructure, I think they've done a good job. But there may be other issues that haven't been explored yet. Also, there's something called IA-Kerb that's coming soon as part of getting rid of NTLM authentication. And this may alter the landscape slightly. Not to get too technical, but IA-Kerb takes the Kerberos traffic that we've been looking at and proxying it through the application server through Spinego, which is a different protocol. So there's potential new places that an MITM could occur with that. So a big question going forward is, And will IA Curb also support fast armoring or something similar to protect the traffic in a similar manner? So definitely some challenges to look at going forward. But remember, armor can come in many forms. In the 1986 cult classic Pretty in Pink, armor in this case means a pink prom dress and a good friend. Like Molly Ringwald's character, Andy, it doesn't protect us from every possible attack, but it does give us the courage and confidence to face our threat landscape instead of ignoring it or avoiding it. So, takeaways is to armor up, think about fast armoring, um, do it with a plan in place and testing and care. And you can roll it out in small doses. Then there's always good old network segmentation to fall back on for some of these attacks. And there's always, consulting that you can bring in. But most importantly, as we go our separate ways, and you're looking to further secure your Active Directory environment, don't forget about RFC 6113. Thanks.
TriMark Vision is the next evolution in the identification of security issues across all your Active Directory environments. The TriMark Risk Score is based on real-world expertise of TriMark's industry-leading Active Directory and Microsoft Cloud security experts. Most importantly, TriMark Vision helps you to answer the questions facing your Active Directory security posture today, such as what risk do I have in my environment? What actionable steps can I take today, tomorrow, this week to best mitigate my risk of an attack on my Active Directory? What should I be most concerned about within my Active Directory forest where it concerns potential attack vectors? What is the current security posture of all my AD forests? TriMark Vision, visibility at the speed of operation.